Hi, everyone. Welcome to Elasticity of Demand Week. Today we will obviously be talking about elasticity of demand. I want to make a quick announcement for those of you who might have missed it on the last lecture, but I have made a change to the way that I am grading your note sheets assignments. So from now on, for every week for your notes, I would like you to leave a space, maybe like a quarter of the page on the top of your first page. Leave a space there when you start taking your notes. And that is the space in which you are going to answer any like pause and reflect or pause and write questions that I put into the lectures. If you turn in notes that do not have that space in the top with all of those questions answered, you will not get credit for your notes. So make sure that you're doing that from this point on. I only want to see note sheets that come from the video lecture material, unless I specify otherwise. Okay, so let's move on. This is what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, we'll go over just what is elasticity and how do economists use that term. And then we'll talk about the three main types of demand elasticity, and that's own price elasticity, income elasticity of demand, cross price inelasticity of demand. Those are the three main types. And then we will talk about and compare some elastic goods with inelastic goods. We'll discuss why businesses might care about elasticity and why economists care about elasticity. And then we'll talk about some agricultural applications for this term. Okay, so first off, what is elasticity? Most of you guys are probably, all of you guys are probably familiar with the term elastic. Like, you know, a rubber band is something that we call elastic. A stretchy t-shirt is elastic. So economists use the term elasticity in a similar way. They use it to describe how much one thing changes in response to a change in something else. So imagine that I had, you know, a rubber band around both of my hands right now. That rubber band is going to get longer, so its length is going to change as I move my hands apart. So the length of the rubber band changes when I change something else, which is the distance of my hands apart. Elasticity of demand, in particular, you can have elasticity of supply too, which we will talk about probably in a few weeks, but elasticity of demand refers to how much demand changes in response to some other change. And there are three main types of elasticity of demand that we really talk about in economics. And that's own price elasticity of demand. That's a response to, in quantity of demand, a response to a change in the price of the good or service. And then you have income elasticity of demand, and that's a response to a change in consumer incomes, how much money people are making. And then we have cross price elasticity of demand, which is how much demand changes in response to a change in the price of another good or service. So let's jump into own price elasticity of demand. So this is defined as how much demand changes in response to a change in the price of that good. So you'll often see this referred to just as price elasticity of demand. We're going to specify own price, like the good's own price versus the price of another good. We're not using own here like I bought and I own it now, not the owner. No, we're talking about the good's own price elasticity of demand. And we measure that as the change or the percent change in demand when the price changes by 1%. So we're going to start here by talking about a couple theoretical scenarios. These aren't things that really exist in reality. Perfectly elastic demand does not really exist in the real world, and neither does perfectly inelastic demand. If you had a good that had perfectly elastic demand, that would mean that At a certain price, you could sell any quantity. You could sell an infinite quantity if it was perfectly elastic. And that's represented by this horizontal demand curve. Horizontal demand curve. Be perfectly elastic. Doesn't really exist. Perfectly inelastic demand would look like this. It would look like a vertical line. And what that means is that you could charge anything you wanted for that good and you would still sell the same quantity. You would still sell the same quantity if you charged $1 million for something. That would be something that's perfectly inelastic. Quantity demanded does not change at all with price. So the closest thing that I can think of that would be something that's perfectly inelastic might be something that's really unique and really valuable. Like if you had, a painting by one of the grandmasters, that's a very unique thing. And an art dealer could probably charge whatever they wanted to. Somebody would buy it just because it's such a unique and remarkable piece. That's something that's close to being perfectly inelastic. But it's not, because there's a price limit to everything, right? There may not even be enough money in the world to buy that piece. So that's perfectly elastic demand and perfectly inelastic demand. Demand curve totally horizontal or demand curve totally vertical. Now, the demand curves that we've been looking at, that you guys looked at quite a bit last week, they look more like this, right? They have a slope to them, and that slope is always negative, right? They slope down and to the right. That's the kind of demand curve that we are used to seeing. Now, that demand curve, it's not always going to be that perfect 45-degree angle. Demand curves can be more gently sloping, like this one over here, or they can be really steep. And that tells us a lot about the elasticity of the good. It tells us a lot about how much a change in price affects the quantity that people want, or that people demand. So a good that is fairly elastic, this curve is gently sloping. It's closer to that horizontal line that we saw in the perfectly elastic demand example. This line tells us that a small change in price here, a small change in price, results in a large change in quantity demanded. So goods that are relatively elastic, the quantity demanded is really responsive to the price. If you raise the price a little bit, you're going to sell a lot less. And if you lower the price a little bit, you're going to sell a lot more. That's a fairly elastic good. Now, something that has fairly inelastic demand has a really steep demand curve, or steeper, closer to vertical demand curve like this. And what that tells us is that a large change in price results in a fairly small change in quantity. So you could drop the price by a lot, but only sell one or two more. That would be an inelastic good. And we'll go over some examples of goods that are elastic and goods that are inelastic in a little bit. Hopefully that will kind of help you cement these concepts. But first, we are going to talk about how and why we calculate these things. So elasticity of demand in any of its forms is a useful measure for business owners, for banks, for people providing loans, for economists, for policymakers. People want to know about the elasticity of demand. And in order to have a terminology to talk about this in, we have these numbers that we've come up with. So this formula, the one on the bottom should just say change in percent change in price. I think it's actually fixed on the next slides. Let me just go that. Okay, so this is our formula for the own price elasticity of demand. It's the percent change, remember this triangle symbol is a delta, it means change or difference in a percent change in the quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. So if we plugged a bunch of numbers in, took a bunch of data, plugged a bunch of numbers in, what that would give us would be a percent change in the quantity demanded for every 1% change in price. So this becomes a uniform number between goods. You end up, let me show you here, you end up with a negative number, always a negative number. Why is that? Think about the way that demand curves are. They always slope down and to the right? We never have a increase in price that results in an increase in the quantity demanded. So this is always going to be a negative number. Now, that being said, the way that we report the number and that you'll most often see it if you look at tables of price elasticity of demand or own price elasticity, the way that you'll see it reported is usually positive. They just care about the absolute value of it. And they're usually pretty small numbers. They're usually like less than 2 or less than 3 or 4. For agricultural goods, oftentimes less than that. So a number like 1.4 or 0.22, this would be the number that gets reported as the own price elasticity of demand. So we could do this calculation for all different kinds of goods and end up with these numbers that we can compare to one another. So if the own price elasticity of demand, if that number ends up greater than 1, if it's 1.4 or 1.7 or 4 or 5 or whatever, if it's greater than 1, we consider the relationship between quantity demanded and price, we consider that relationship to be elastic. So the quantity demanded is really responsive to a change in price. So that means that a 1% change in price equates to a greater than 1% change in the quantity demanded. If that number is 1 exactly, equal to 1, then we call the elasticity unitary. Now this is not very common, but yeah, unitary elasticity would be if it's equal to 1. Usually things fall a little bit more on the elastic side or a little bit more on the inelastic side. If the number is less than 1, this means that the relationship is inelastic. So a 1% change in price results in a less than 1% change in the quantity demanded. It's not very responsive to a change in price, or consumers are not very responsive to a change in price of that product. So I want you guys to go ahead and stop and write this table down in your notes, and then just jot down next to it, which of these goods do you think are elastic and which do you think are inelastic? Okay, so moving on. Next is the income elasticity of demand. So this is a different type of elasticity of demand that we might calculate and use. And this refers to how much demand changes for a good in response to consumers' change in income. So we've also kind of talked about this, right? Like as consumers make more money, we generally buy more stuff. And we might buy more of different stuff. So we measure this as the percent change in demand when consumers' income changes by 1%. Now the formula looks really similar to that last formula that we looked at. It's just the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in income. And we come up with some kind of number. Now this number, it can be negative. And we'll talk about that in a second. It can be negative, that's okay. So if the income elasticity of demand is a negative number, this means that as income rises, demand falls. And as income lowers, demand rises. And that might sound familiar from last week or 2 weeks ago when we talked about normal goods and inferior goods. So a good that is inferior, demand falls when people start making more money, right? They switch to better or more valuable substitutes, or not substitutes, but better goods that serve the same purpose. So if the number from this equation is negative, then that means that the good is inferior. If the good is, or if the number is positive, but it's less than 1, so it's between 0 and 1, we call that good a necessity. It's a necessity. Our change in income doesn't really change how much of it we buy, right? So, for example, like sandwich bread that you buy at the store, hopefully just because you have more money doesn't mean that you want more sandwiches. So these kinds of goods are not very responsive to changes in consumers' income. Now, goods that have a value, an income elasticity of demand value that is greater than 1, that means that the good is a luxury. That means that as income rises, the quantity that you sell or that people buy also rises. So think, as people make more money, they can buy newer computers or newer iPhones. They can buy Rolex watches and all that stuff. Those are luxury goods. So income in elasticity of demand is greater than 1 for a luxury good. So when our income changes, as far as food choices go, most of us don't, food insecurity issues aside, which I recognize that's a big issue in the world and also in this country. But for a lot of us who don't have issues with food insecurity, as your income rises, you don't necessarily consume more food, right? You might change the foods that you purchase. So for example, we know based on data that as incomes rise across consumers, consumers start demanding more high value foods like fish and beef and poultry and shellfish, fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables. They demand more of those kinds of goods. And at the same time, they demand less things like potatoes, eggs, cereal, more like staple stuff that they can swap out for higher value products. Now, luxury foods are kind of an interesting thing. And we're going to set that aside for a minute, but most foods have pretty small but positive income elasticity. So that means that as we make more money, we might buy a little bit more, but we don't buy, a ton more food just because we made a little bit more money. Maybe we throw the odd dinner party now and again, but our overall demand of food doesn't change that much in relation to income. Luxury foods are kind of an interesting thing. As incomes rise, people may start buying a lot more caviar and lobster and things like that. Or I don't know if you guys have heard of these melons that are grown in greenhouses in Hokkaido. It's like a cantaloupe that's grown in such specific conditions that it's supposed to be the best cantaloupe you can eat. And I certainly can't afford to eat these. I've never tried one. They're hundreds of dollars per melon. Actually, the most expensive ones where there was a pair that was sold for like $42,000 for 2 melons. Now, that's a good that has a very high income elasticity of demand. You have to, as people's incomes go down, their consumption of these fancy melons goes way down. So it's very, very responsive. to changes in income. Okay, our last type of elasticity of demand is cross-price elasticity of demand. And that's how much the demand for one good changes in response to a change in the price of another good. So this is measured as the percent change in demand when there's a 1% change in the price of another good. That's probably starting to sound pretty familiar now. And this equation probably looks pretty familiar too. It's very similar to the other ones we looked at. It's the percent change in quantity demanded of good one divided by the percent change in the price for good two. So this should sound kind of familiar because we've already talked about substitutes and complements. So the result of this equation, if we did the math, we came up with some numbers. That number would tell us whether good one or good two and good two are substitutes, if they're complements, or if they're what we call independent. So if the answer to this equation is a positive number, that means that the goods are substitutes. So as the price of good two goes up, the quantity demanded of good one goes up, and vice versa. If the price goes down, then the quantity of good one also goes down. Those are substitutes. People switch to more affordable options when the price of a good goes up. If that number is negative, then the goods are complements. So as the price of one good goes down, then the quantity demanded of another good also goes down. Sorry, goes up. So as the price of good two goes up, people are buying less of good two, right? And if it's a complement and they go together, they're also buying less of good one. So if it's a negative number, those goods are complements. If it works out to be zero, then that means that good one and good two don't really have anything to do with one another economically. The price of one doesn't affect the quantity of the other. So that's cross-price elasticity of demand. Now, what are some goods that we consider to be very elastic? So goods that consumers really change the amount that they buy based on the price. Luxury goods are a really great example of this. You have things like sports cars and airline tickets, fancy vacations, new computers and new iPhones, designer clothing, going out to eat at fancy restaurants. Those are all things that are really elastic. So, and now we're talking about general elasticity. So kind of those three types of elasticity that we just talked about rolled together, and we were just calling that elasticity. And when you study economics or when you read about the market, you might encounter folks talking about how elastic things are. And just know that that refers to the three types kind of put together. So yeah, these luxury goods, one reason that they're very elastic is because of income elasticity, right? Another reason is more about like substitutability. So goods that have many cheap substitutes, like soda, like you can drink Coke instead of Pepsi pretty easily and for not that much more money. You can substitute Burger King for McDonald's. Most places that have one fast food place have multiple fast food places. So goods with many cheap substitutes, those are also really elastic goods. Consumers change the way that they consume them with relative ease based on other factors. So goods, oops, skip the page. All right, goods that are very inelastic. So these are things that even when there are big swings in price or big swings in consumers' income, consumers' consumption of these items doesn't really change that much. So essential goods are a good example of this. Medications that are necessary. So like insulin is one of the ultimate examples of an inelastic good because insulin-dependent diabetics, they need insulin to stay alive, right? So the price of insulin could be changed dramatically and people still need to buy the same quantity. So things like medications, insurance, everybody needs health insurance and everyone is supposed to have car insurance. And if you own a home, you should probably have homeowners insurance. Insurance is an essential good and therefore the price can fluctuate a lot and you still have to buy the same level of insurance. Utilities like water and electricity, most people need water and electricity in their home. Therefore, that is an inelastic good. And then you have this kind of funny category of unique goods and goods that are controlled by monopolies, like diamonds for a long time were controlled by a very strong monopoly. And now I know we just talked about luxury goods as being very elastic, but diamonds are kind of like one of the exceptions. And Taylor Swift is too, and we'll talk about her in a second. But yeah, diamonds are considered very inelastic. One reason is that there are not that many substitutes for things like diamond engagement rings and diamond earrings. If you are in a certain level of society, that is just like a thing that is done. And so the amount of diamonds that consumers demand at that level of income doesn't really change. There are also not very many substitutes. I mean, now you have like, you know, lab created diamonds and you have some diamond lookalikes, but for the most part, there isn't really a substitute for a diamond. It's a very unique good. Works of art, like we talked about, are very unique and valuable. Therefore, they are inelastic. And then we've got Taylor Swift concert tickets. I don't know about you guys, but I have friends who paid way more money than they could afford to go see Taylor Swift. There's only one person in the world who can put on a Taylor Swift concert, and that's her. Tickets are really expensive. She doesn't tour that often. So buying a Taylor Swift concert ticket, that's a really unique good. And therefore it's going to be pretty inelastic. People are going to spend that money just because it's so important to them and it's such a unique experience. They're going to go ahead and spend that money, even if prices are totally exorbitant, which they were. Okay, so that is inelastic goods. So I want you to take a second to read this prompt and then go ahead and answer it in the top of your notes. So pause your video if you haven't done so already. And then I'm going to move on. You can replay when you are ready. All right, so why do we care about elasticity? Well, there's a few reasons that businesses would really care about elasticity. And that has to do with how they decide to make revenue. So businesses could decide that in order to make more revenue, they want to just charge more for their product. This may work in some cases. It may not work in other cases. And its success depends on the elasticity of demand of that good. So here we have the graph for a good that is relatively elastic good. So if our business, if we increased our price, if we increased our price a little bit, hoping to make more money, then we would sell significantly less of the good if it's a very elastic good. small increase in price, significant decrease in quantity, right? Now, depending on how many consumers you have and what you're charging, increasing the price, instead of increasing your revenue, it may actually decrease your revenue. So for elastic goods, you have to be really careful about if you're deciding to increase price, is that going to hurt your overall sales or help your overall sales? Maybe the answer to improve your overall revenue is actually decreasing the price if we're talking about an elastic good. So a good with fairly inelastic demand, this might be the kind of good that you could get away with raising the price on to make more money. And that's because a large change in price results in a small change in quantity, because the slope is so steep that, losing one or two customers, it might be worth getting more money out of the rest of your customers. So decisions on pricing are heavily reliant on whether a good is elastic or inelastic and its degree of being elastic or inelastic. For farmers, farmers can use a few different sets of data to answer some really important questions. So one of those sets of data is the price elasticity of demand. And the other set of data is something called futures prices. So futures prices are basically estimates of the price of goods in the future. So if you have, you might hear the term like corn futures or wheat futures. They're talking about the estimated future price of corn at a certain time or of wheat at a certain time. So if you combine this data from futures price of a good and the price elasticity of demand of the good, it can tell you some pretty important things. You could use it to predict how much your production costs are going to change. So how much it's going to cost you to produce the same amount of goods. Alfalfa is a good example of this, alfalfa use in dairy farming. So dairy farmers often feed their cows a lot of alfalfa because it's a very protein-rich diet. It has a lot of the other nutrients that you need to produce good milk. So it's really valuable for dairy farmers. So if a dairy farmer were to look up the future prices of alfalfa, and they saw that they're getting pretty high, we know that alfalfa has a low elasticity. One of the reasons for this is that it's so necessary for dairy farmers. Like dairy farmers can't just feed their cows less hay because hay got more expensive. They still need to feed them the same amount. So there's low elasticity there. And if you combine that with high futures, it could tell a farmer that their production costs are going to get higher. So that's a valuable piece of information. You could use it to predict the revenue of for what you sell. So if the price of dairy in the future was going to be low, but we know that dairy has high elasticity, then the farmer will know that demand for dairy is going to be high in the future. So they're going to sell more units of dairy. So those are some ways that farmers might use elasticity information to plan for their business or to make decisions. Okay, so where do agricultural products fit into this? Overall, luxury foods aside, food demand remains relatively inelastic as compared to other goods like clothes and computers and cars and all those other things we buy. Food demand is relatively inelastic. It doesn't change that much as prices change. And there's a few reasons for this. One is a biological reason, and that's simply that there isn't a substitute for food, right? We need to eat food to survive. We need it. You can't just drink more water and not eat food. But that being said, anyone can only consume so much food. There's a point where you're just going to be throwing it away, so people don't even buy it. The types of food you change that they might change, sorry, the types of food that you buy may change with your income, but in general, the quantity doesn't change too much. So that kind of keeps the demand really steady. There's also social and cultural reasons. Um, Anyone who has, say, tried to go on a diet or wanted to stop eating fast food or become vegetarian or, eat more boneless, skinless chicken, whatever it is. Anyone who's tried to change the way that they habitually eat knows that it's really hard. It's not an easy thing to change your food choices. We're used to eating certain foods. Some have cultural significance or emotional significance or lifestyle significance. Um, yeah, we are creatures of habit. Humans are creatures of habit. We like what we like, and it's hard to change that. So on the whole, consumers' diets is pretty slow to change. So demand for certain foods is slower to change in comparison to demand for other goods, even when there are large price swings. When things that we like become more expensive, we still really like them. And if we can afford them, we still buy them. Um, there is such a thing as a short-term elasticity, which is how much demand changes in the short term versus long-term elasticity. So how much demand changes in the long term. So food demand could be more elastic in the long term, if people continue to want to eat healthier, say, or shift more to eating at home versus eating out. There can be some elasticity in the long term, but in the short term, we talk about food demand as being relatively inelastic. All right, so that is the first intro to demand elasticity.